You've asked me to talk about a teacher or teachers in my life. It's easier for me to talk about teachers. But when I think about my teachers, the one I think about most often is I guess it was first grade teacher. Her name was Ms. Perkins. And the thing I remember most about her was her permitting me to hold on to her hand during playground. I guess I must have been a shy kid, but of all of the things I remember about Miss Perkins was as we navigated the playground at school, I was holding on to her hand. My second thoughts turn to two of my teachers who had an interesting relationship. One of them is W.E.B. Du Bois. I think of him as teacher when he really was mentor. I had my encounters with him well into my adult years. He lived next door to the psychiatrist who was head of the clinic where I was a psychologist many, many years ago. I think this was in the 50s, the last 5 or 6, maybe even 7 years that Du Bois lived in this country. He and his wife Shirley were neighbors to my friends Joe and Helen Werthers, who introduced my wife and me to Du Bois. I'm not quite sure why, but we kind of fit into each other's lives at that time. I'm sorry, and became friends. Whereupon for the next 6-7 years, so there's between 51 and 1958, we hung out with each other 2, 3, 4, 5 times a month. He was still doing some lectures. I frequently escorted him to them. I certainly attended practically all of them. Our families had lunch or supper together a couple of times a month. But what Du Bois did for me was to put the kind of capstone on my education. I like to think that he taught me how to think. Du Bois had kind of encyclopedic grasp of knowledge. He knew about just about everything. But what stands out in my encounters with him, whether he was lecturing or simply talking casually about a subject, he insisted on putting it in context. He liked to talk about the origins of things, the whys of things, the meaning of things. He seemed to think that what things mean was more important than what they are. I guess in that sense he was something of an existentialist. But the years following the decade in which I knew him, I think of myself as having become a different kind of scholar. I'm not much of an experimental or empirical scholar. I have done little experimental work. My work tends to draw on the work of other people. In my memoir, I talk about my being a kind of parasitic scholar, that is, living off the works of other people as you review my work. Unlike Du Bois, I have taken existing knowledge, existing thoughts, and reconceptualize them. But the place I learned to practice and respect that kind of scholarship was at Du Bois' knee. Talking to Du Bois, or consulting with him, or listening to him. Du Bois, despite the fact that in his early work he did empirical scholarship, in his later years he was a scholar of scholarship. He was a analyst and reconceptualizer of the notions behind other people's work, the context out of which that work had grown, and most important, the multiple meanings of a particular set of findings. That model is pretty much the model of my mature work. I indicated that I was going to talk about two of those people who were related. The second was Du Bois' protege, Alain Locke. Alain Locke, I think, was about the second African American to earn a PhD from Harvard. He and Du Bois were very proud and even jealous of their position. Locke had no question but that Du Bois was the senior scholar. Du Bois had no question but that he was the superior scholar. But having studied with both of them, it was interesting the subtle but almost humorous competition between them. Locke knew that there was no one except Du Bois who could intellectually compete with him. Du Bois thought that Locke was a star, but clearly Du Bois is junior. But Locke's role in my life was to have picked me up after I was dismissed from Howard University for poor scholarship. Du Bois saw me the day I was leaving campus and invited me to, if I said Du Bois, I meant Locke, saw me the day that I was leaving campus and invited me to check him out, to come back to see him as the first thing I would do when I returned after the one semester that I had to be off campus, having flunked out. And I did, and sure enough, Locke taught me how to be a student. He taught me how to get through college. So in a sense, Locke and Du Bois started and put the finishing touches on my education.